for the Republic is hosting a debate on war and the Constitution with Bruce Fein, a senior policy advisor to the Ron Paul 2012 campaign, and John Yoo, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel at the U.S. Department of Justice. Both are authors of books on the Constitution. Live coverage of this debate just getting underway here on C-SPAN 2.
John Yoo on the left. John, stand up. John was Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel in the Bush Justice Department. John wrote a number of key legal memos supporting Bush's post-9/11 counterterrorism policies. And then Bruce, stand up. Bruce was Associate Deputy Attorney General under President Reagan and also was Chief Policy Advisor to Rand Paul during the 2012 presidential campaign. Thank you. And Harvey, stand up. Harvey's going to be our moderator. And Harvey is currently Dean of the National War College. Harvey's last job was director of his last government job. You worked in for the director of national intelligence. Thank you, Harvey Grishkoff. Good. Just stay. There wasn't a single founder who doubted that going to war was the most important decision the Republic could make. The war power is the most important power because war is the greatest threat to the Republic. War concentrates power in the executive. Since the executive has more of an incentive to go to war than the legislature, the founders placed the power to declare war in the legislature, not in the president. Now, the founder who understood war better than any other founder was George Washington, who, upon leaving as retiring as the first president of the United States, he gave a long farewell address in which he spelled out the foreign policy of the founders. Washington said we should stay neutral in foreign wars. We should shun military alliances with all foreign powers because they would entangle us in their wars. To support neutrality, Washington said we should be wary of overgrown military establishments. He said we should not borrow more money in our generation than we can pay off. And, of course, avoid political factions. Sounds pretty good to me. I'm sticking with George. But let's see what our speakers have to say tonight. Harvey, why don't you come up? You're the moderator. We're going to do 10 minutes each. Bruce, you're going to go first, and then John, and then Harvey's going to ask some questions of the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to all of you to talk. Thanks.
Good evening. Thank you for coming out. I want to thank the press club for being so generous to
I wish they could do this with Bruce's microphone.
There it is. All right. Well, good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight. I want to thank the Press Club for being so generous and the organization to do this. We've done this a number of times, John and Bruce and myself. First, I have to make the caveat. I am with the National War College and the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Law and National Security, but I'm here in my personal capacity and not representing those two organizations per se. But we think it's very important to have events like this, and you could not have two more experienced debaters. And what we're going to do, as was laid out, is that we'll have 10 minutes on each side, and then we'll have 5 minutes of rebuttal, and then I'll pose a few questions that may have been raised by the speakers. Can I borrow a pen, actually? Does someone have a pen out there? I realize that my job would be very upset. Thank you so much. And then I think what we want to do is to get the audience involved and have people, and what I encourage you to do is, as a law professor, ask short, crisp questions. I don't think this is an opportunity to have political speeches, and it really is an opportunity to sharpen the debate that will take place on executive power and war. And as was pointed out, it's an extraordinarily timely issue that has great historical legacy and real contemporary power. So with that, Bruce, why don't you start off?
All those who seek to destroy liberty in democratic nations ought to know that war is the surest and the shortest means to accomplish it. Those were the words written by Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy of America over 150 years ago. And the Founding Fathers were prescient in recognizing that fact. James Wilson, one of the founding generation, spoke about putting clogs in the arteries of war. And that was why virtually every member of the Constitutional Convention and the ratification debates understood that only Congress, not the executive branch, could authorize the initiation of warfare. Congress doesn't aggrandize power. Its power diminishes in times of war. Now, what is it that makes war so threatening to our Republican dispensation? First, the power of the government concentrates in the executive. It wrenches our customary separation of powers principles. Congress and the judiciary are reduced to virtual ink blots. The courts seldom, if ever, interfere with any national security decision of the president. And we can see today the president claiming power during the so-called war against al-Qaeda, ISIS, Iraq, or otherwise, the power unilaterally to kill any American citizen on his say-so alone if he declares them an imminent danger to the United States. The most awesome power ever entrusted to any individual. There's no judicial review. There's no congressional review. It is final. But that's not the only awesome power that the president wields as well in times of war. Think of the powers of surveillance that were disclosed by Edward Snowden. But even before then, shortly after 9/11, the president claimed the power under his terrorist surveillance program to intercept emails, conversations of Americans internationally without any statutory authorization whatsoever, not even a FISA court. And then we have the detentions without accusation or trial at Guantanamo Bay, where we don't have customary due process, where we have a chance to confront your accusers. You're not accused of any particular crime or wrongdoing. But these are examples, I think, of how the powers of the presidency climb during wartime. And presidents never surrender the power back. But there's a second, I think, wrench in our system during war, and that is customary transparency, the heart of the idea of government by the consent of the governed, yields to secrecy. And government by the consent of the governed is mocked if the people do not know what their government is doing. How can they give consent? And you find then discrepancies between what the government does and what the people would want if they knew what was going on. And I think that's shown rather dramatically with Edward Snowden's disclosures. Ever since 2006, the American people were ignorant of the telephony metadata program run by the National Security Agency. Congress knew, but they were too frightened and invertebrate to disclose it to the American people, even though they had speech or debate clause protection. But with the disclosures, the American people were alarmed by the fact that the NSA was collecting telephony metadata on every single phone call they had been involved in, domestic or international. There were no exceptions. And the collection was made without any suspicion that any of the data indicated involvement in terrorism, crime, or otherwise. It was just collection. Now, think of that program. When it was revealed to the public, they were generally aghast, and it was the public pressure that forced President Obama to curtail the program by executive order and followed by congressional hearings for the first time that were genuine, all provoked by Edward Snowden. Indeed, imagine a lot of conversations you've had over liberty and the right to be left alone you've had because of Edward Snowden, not because of Congress or the executive. But this kind of secrecy is characteristic during wartime. And secrecy also, I believe, leads to misguided decisions of the type of the Bay of Pigs, where we had the CIA forecasting that Cuban people would rise up en masse against Fidel Castro, and it was a disaster. I think President Kennedy said he wished the New York Times had leaked the Bay of Pigs before it actually happened, so it has saved him from that kind of folly. But aside from that, it's simply a basic principle that in the United States, we the people are sovereign. We get to decide our own destiny. And how does that occur if we don't even know what the government is doing? And that's a key attendant of all wars. And then a third major, I think, detriment of war is it invariably cripples civil liberties. Invariably cripples civil liberties. Safety is always viewed as supreme. So the right to be let alone crumbles. Due process, we have military commissions that combine the prosecution and adjudicative function with the Founding Fathers styled as the very definition of tyranny, superseding civilian courts. We have the surveillance, not just with the NSA, but increasingly use of surveillance drones to watch where we're going when we walk outside. We have a sense of government programs that are initiated by the president through his claimed executive authority that we're still clueless about. Ed Snowden did not have access to all the spying that the government was undertaking, and it's probably true that there are additional intrusions on our privacy that we still don't know about because of the secrecy and the general tendency during wartime to subordinate everything to safety. That's not what the Founding Fathers believed. The Fourth Amendment was based upon the idea that we take risks that other people don't take in order to be free. It was captured in a 1763 address that William Pitt the Elder made to the Parliament. And this was the spark of the American Revolution. And it shows you, I think, how distant we've been from our roots when we think and listen to these ringing words. The poorest man in his cottage, he said, may bid defiance to all the forces of the crown. It may be frail, the roof may shake, the winds may enter, the storms may enter, the rain may enter, but the King of England cannot enter. All his forces may not cross the threshold of the ruined tenement. Now think of how at variance our lives are today compared with that understanding of the right to be left alone. And then there's a fourth principle that I'll address very quickly, and it really is the heart of who we are as a people. It was that we believe that it's more acceptable for us to take the risk of being the victim of injustice than to be complicit in it. We don't want to take stupid risks, but let me just explain one situation where the point is made rather graphically. About a year ago, there was a hearing held by Congressman Alan Grayson of Florida, which featured a 9-year-old granddaughter from Pakistan. And she related that on one day, her 68-year-old grandmother asked her to come pick vegetables. So they're out picking vegetables, and the 9-year-old said, then once there appeared darkness in the sky, and then humming noise. And then she began to run, and she thought she heard screams. She looked at her hands that were bleeding. She ran and she looked at her hands again, tried to get the blood to stop, but it couldn't. And then she looked and her grandmother was exterminated by a predator drone. That is complicity in injustice. Sometimes it's impossible, inescapable in wartime. But that is another reason why we try to resist going to war except in self-defense.
If Congress doesn't want any war to occur, they just need not fund it. This was a perfect check back in the 1780s and 90s, of course, because we didn't have a standing army and navy. And so when the president ever wanted to fight a war, he would have to go to Congress and say, please build me the military. Today we have a military that is designed to conduct wars in other people's countries. It is an expeditionary military, and that is at the design of Congress. Congress has created a military designed to prevent war from ever getting here by fighting it in other people's countries. I would say we've had actually many decades of agreement between the president and Congress. So I only have time's up. So to a law professor, it means I have 10 more minutes. So just to conclude. Okay, so let me conclude saying this. I think we should all have concerns about executive power, but I don't think it's from foreign affairs. I think many of us in this room are more concerned about President Obama's use of executive power domestically, the refusal to enforce laws, the selective use of the IRS, and so on. There, I think, he is in violation of the Constitution, because there I think in domestic affairs the presidency was not designed to play this leading role of initiative. There in domestic affairs, the president is supposed to enforce the laws Congress passed. But I think it's a mistake to assume, I think conservatives make the mistake and liberals make the mistake to assume that a narrow presidency at home must be a narrow presidency abroad, or a powerful president at home has to be a powerful president abroad.
Professor, thank you. So what we've had now is John has invoked both Hamilton, he's invoked the Federalist 74, he's invoked Federalist 70, and usually Bruce invokes Madison, Federalist Paper 50 and 51. So, Bruce, where do you stand now with him having both Hamilton and Madison as?
I think it's fair to say that those who drafted and ratified the Constitution were virtually uniform in believing, one, that executive power abroad was the most dangerous because war is the most threatening to liberty, as de Tocqueville explained. And secondly, that was why Congress was entrusted with that decision. George Washington, aside from making the Neutrality Proclamation, he also made the proclamation only Congress can authorize the offensive use of war. Thomas Jefferson went to Congress on repeated occasions to get authorization to fight the Barbary pirates. James Madison made it very, very clear in all of his writings, both as a member of the House of Representatives and communicating with Thomas Jefferson as president himself when he went to Congress to fight the War of 1812, that the reason why Congress was entrusted with this exclusive power is because the executive has an incentive to concoct excuses for war, because the executive gets the power. Not only was that true in 1787, but all of history shows that wars typically begin with executive officials. John Jay in Federalist 4 points out that they all have these ulterior motives in the executive branch to go to war, and we didn't want to be that country. So I think it's fair to say that those who were primary in drafting the Constitution all agreed only Congress could authorize the initiation of war. You're exalting form over substance if you want to say declare war as something else, because the fact is, when they thought of the option of executive power unilaterally, they said, but the president needs to respond to repel sudden invasions. So that's obviously something that could be done, whether at Pearl Harbor or otherwise. Now, we go to the idea of executive power that John was making with regard to Mr. Lincoln. The Confederates bombed and shelled Fort Sumter. He wasn't the one who initiated warfare. It was the equivalent of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Lincoln didn't say, I can go to war to make the Union together. There was war initiated against the Union forces. Moreover, he then, with regard to his extraordinary use of executive power, asked and received congressional ratification for what he had done. He recognized that there was an illegitimacy tainted with unilateral executive action. And I also would dispute the idea that, we had all these great things that have happened by giving the president this unilateral authority. Take, for example, Vietnam. That was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that said, President, go to war whether he wants to go to war. Now we have a Vietnam War Memorial with 58,000 names, and people wonder, why did they die? We're protecting Vietnam from Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. What did they die for? As John Kerry said before he became Secretary of State and before he entered the Senate, who was going to tell the last soldier in Vietnam what he died for? Who's going to tell the last soldier who dies in Afghanistan what he died for? By the way, President Obama did not remove our troops from Afghanistan. Indeed, he initially increased troops in Afghanistan. They're still there today. What happens in 2015, nobody knows, but that ought to be a decision that Congress makes. Lastly, I don't think that simply because Congress is derelict in exercising its responsibilities, then that exonerates presidential lawlessness as well. After all, we do have a third branch of government called the federal judiciary, which should step in appropriate occasions and find that if the two branches abdicate their responsibilities, the court can hold things unconstitutional. One of the great oversights on that score happened in World War II. Remember, pursuant to executive order that Congress ratified, President Roosevelt created concentration camps for 120,000 Japanese American citizens and resident aliens, based upon the intelligence they got from General DeWitt on the West Coast that even though he couldn't find any evidence of sabotage or espionage amongst the Japanese Americans, it was a confirming indication that treason was afoot, because they're so clever to hide what they were doing. And there's an example where the Supreme Court got the cases, Korematsu and Hirabayashi, and folded. They made a great statement at the outset. Racial distinctions are odious to a free people, but not in times of war. In any event, I don't think that we can just wash our hands just because Congress and the President don't understand their constitutional responsibilities.
So, John, Bruce has made a strong argument about supine Congress and a judiciary that somehow loses its way in the context of war. What is your reaction to that sort of line of reasoning and argument, given your view of executive power?
Well, first I think that it might be an artifact of the modern time to assume always that's the president who's the most warlike, and it's Congresses that are pacifist, and therefore we should give them a check on the presidency. Obviously, we've lived in times where the exact reverse was the case, where Congress has been the more warlike, and presidents have been the one that not wanted war. We've had 5 declared wars. I would point 2 of them fit this description: War of 1812 and the War of 1898, were wars where Congress was the more warlike and the president was not. So to say that we have to design this entire system, or the framers designed this entire system because they were worried about the executive alone being too warlike and too interested in military adventures, and Congress always being passive or pacifist, I think is mistaken. Second, I think there's always going to be mistakes in government decisions, and there are going to always be mistakes in wars. And so I think what Bruce is focusing on, and Harvey's question raises this, is he's only talking about one kind of error. What social scientists, now those of you who are not interested in social science can leave, but social scientists will call this type 1 errors. Errors where you go to war by mistake. So people would say Iraq or Vietnam, or I think, Bruce, I would disagree with him, but he seems to think Afghanistan also fits into this category now. Or if I can take your quote about the soldier dying in Afghanistan, right? Those are wars where we shouldn't have gone to war. The framers could be equally worried about what we call type 2 errors, errors of omission, times when we should have gone to war when we didn't. And what I worry about, and I would say World War II is a good example of that, where we delayed going into a war that was just and that we should have gone into earlier. And I think that the framers did not want to have a paralyzed government either. And I worry that creating a system like the kind Bruce is in favor of, which I might add is not one that presidents and Congresses have followed when they've put the Constitution into practice, that this would lead to a kind of paralysis of our ability to defend ourselves. And then the last thing I'll just point out, Bruce made reference to, well, all the framers agreed about this and about war and so on. I don't think that's true either. So I would take a look at the constitutional text. And I have a free copy someone just gave me. I expect that someplace like the Committee on the Republic, we all have a copy today with us at all times. Article 1, Section 10 says, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, engage in war, unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. Right? That is exactly the constitutional balance of powers that Bruce thinks should apply between the president and Congress. All you would have had to do as a framer was take out the word state, put in president, and it was said, no president shall, without the consent of Congress, engage in war. With the exceptions everyone thinks ought to be in there, unless we're invaded, or there's such imminent danger of attack that you can't delay. Why can't our framers have written that exact clause if that's what they intended, what Bruce thinks? Instead, they didn't. They wrote provisions that gave some powers to the president, some powers to Congress, and they expected them to fight it out.
So we all have our copies of the Congress. That's how you know we're law professors. But one of bring the argument to the contemporary period. I know both, John, you were involved in the authorization for the use of military force and the broad power it gave the president. So I think I'll let Bruce go first. Your understanding of the authorization for the use of military force and the president's current request that perhaps he requires another authorization to use military force in the current situation Could you address the sort of the policy?
To what the president could do or could not. But Congress surely has not authorized a statute that says we are hereby empowering the president to kill American citizens just because he thinks they're a danger and there's no judicial review or any other review.
Okay, I see a question way in the back. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Ann Wright. I'm a retired U.S. Army colonel, also a former diplomat who helped reopen the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan in December of 2001. And then I resigned in 2003 in opposition to the war in Iraq. So all of this is very personal to me, as with many of you all. The either intended or unintended consequences of giving legal opinions to allow a president to do essentially whatever he wants to, I think has been very dangerous for our country and the rest of the world. And how can we control these types of presidential decisions backed up by John Yoo and a host of lawyers who, in my opinion, did not serve the government well and the people well by the allowing of this type of overreach by the president. Thank you.
I think we've already got. We already know because it was conveyed about 1 year ago when President Obama was poised to launch about 600 cruise missiles into Syria. And the American people got awakened from their unfortunate slumber and wrote in and campaigned with members of Congress, said, no, we do not want another war. The president then retreated. Congress hemmed and hawed, didn't do anything, and then we ultimately ended up with this rather amateurish belief that if we destroyed the chemical weapons, it was all right to kill them by other means, and we think we'd accomplish great things. But that shows still, I think, the Syrian example shows that the Congress and the president still are responsive to what the American people believe are the requirements of danger that justify going to war.
So, John, this question always raises the role of the lawyer in the policy process and the role of the system. And how do you now reflecting? How do you sort of understand those roles and the functions when you're almost been attorneys in the government giving advice to our institutions?
I'm sorry the colonel didn't think much of my government service. I'm sorry about that. I, however, still think I respect your service, no matter your point of view.
Well, I respect your service, but not your policies.
That's not what you said in your question. But however, let me let me answer the question. So first, I would say my belief is that each branch of government is responsible for advancing its own policies, using its own constitutional powers. And I think if there are lawyers in the executive branch who have maintained this position that goes back many decades, thinking that the president can use force even without any congressional declaration of war, then I expect Congress to have its own lawyers and its own institutions, and they are supposed to fight back. And that's what the framers intended. That's how they intended our constitutional mechanism to work. And so I don't think it's a case. If you go back to 2001, you were there, I was there. This was not a case where the president was saying, I'm going to war, damn Congress. And this was not a war where Congress is saying, please don't go to war, please don't go to war. This was a case where Congress is attacking the executive, if you remember those days, for being too passive, for allowing the 9/11 attacks to happen. And my memory of it is that the President and Congress were in a fair amount of agreement in 2001 to be very aggressive in taking the fight into Afghanistan and taking the fight against the terrorists. So I don't see this division of authority between the President and Congress. We obviously have one now, and we've had one at least since, I'd say, 2004, 2005. But that shouldn't detract from, I don't think the constitutional system broke down in 2001. I don't think that the President and Congress were in disagreement, and I don't see signs from that first 2 years that Congress are trying to stop the President in any way from conducting the war. In fact, I think if Congress had wanted to, they had ample powers at their disposal to do so, and they chose not to exercise them. Instead, they passed the AUMF from 2001, an unprecedentedly broad authorization to use force.
I need to give a counterexample because this is important of the model for government service. This is my involvement in Watergate, and there became a time when President Nixon
is yourself.
believed. No, that's not.
You were a prosecutor.
No, I was at the Justice Department at the time of Watergate, and the Attorney General was Elliot Richardson. And the President of the United States believed he had the authority to fire unilaterally Archibald Cox, who was the special prosecutor who was getting dangerously close to uncovering criminal evidence against the President. And Mr. Richardson said, no, I'm quitting. I'm not firing Archibald Cox. And Bill Ruckelshaus, his deputy, said, I'm quitting too. I'm not firing Archibald Cox, even though you're directing me to do that. And the entire Department of Justice in the aftermath listened to Elliot Richardson and gave him standing ovations bigger than at the Olympics for that courage. But that's an alternate way to... Judge Bork, what had happened is that the department would have been acephalous without a Solicitor General who was acting, and Judge Bork was approached by Mr. Richardson and asked him to stay on so the special prosecutor's office wouldn't dissolve, much to our ultimate benefit.
I can't let that example go. First,
now you know why they asked me to do this. Okay, very brief.
Yeah. So first, I think that I don't know, Bruce, whether you agree with this, but I think it was actually constitutionally incorrect for the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General to say the President cannot fire a prosecutor. So I actually think they were in the wrong, and I think Judge Bork did the right thing. He carried out the President's order. The President is the chief law enforcement officer. Congress's power to respond was to impeach the President, which they ultimately did.
But you've missed an important point. The case went to litigation called Nader versus Bork, and Judge Gerhard Gazelle ruled that it was illegal and wrongful to discharge Mr. Richardson despite your view of the Constitution.
Okay, I think we'll move on to another issue.
Bruce, I could read more in the New York Times about classified information than if I go in and listen to the hearings, they'll tell me I can't talk about anything that I listen to. So that's adequate oversight? It is a joke.
Well, I always in the Constitution you have to make this point, which is that there's the First Amendment, which is dear to us all, and there's also Article 1, Section 5, which says that each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings, and from time to time publish the same, excepting such parts as it may, in their judgment, require secrecy. And the yeas and nays of the members of either house on any question shall, at the demise of 1/5 of those present, be entered on the journal. We always point out that even George Washington and that founding fathers realized there was an issue of secrecy, but they also had an issue of the First Amendment, and that's part of the tension that this debate usually brings up. Sir.
Arif Panju, Institute for Justice. My question is for Mr. Yu and Mr. Fine, if he wants to rebut.
Did the whole office come? How many more are you here?
I think my good colleague and I.
Does everyone from the office get a question?
I think
what
the Constitution.
What about the supporters of the empire? Do they get any questions? I think they have a. Don't they have a group?
Properly read, the Constitution has a presumption of liberty. It's the powers that are enumerated and thus limited. And earlier you mentioned that the courts shouldn't really waste their political capital on engaging on issues involving the exercise of power and focus more on individual liberty. But the exercise of power does implicate individual liberty. So focusing on a more contemporary example, which the authorizations post 9/11, how did the implications on individual liberty make their way into the analysis? How does the executive branch do that? Because it seems that, from what we see in the aftermath, that things probably didn't go as planned.
So I think, obviously, the president takes an oath to execute the law, to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, and the supreme law is the Constitution. And so the president has an obligation. Oh, I thought he was giving me signals like he was my manager and he was telling me to throw a curveball.
He's not a third base coach. Okay. He just wants the mic.
So I think that the president obviously has to carry out the Constitution. That is the supreme law. And, in fact, laws or judicial decisions or executive actions which violate the Constitution aren't to be carried out. Right? And so the executive branch has to follow the Bill of Rights as well. And so the primary issue that Bruce has mentioned is the surveillance program, which has obviously strong tensions with the Fourth Amendment and the right to privacy and the right against warrantless searches and seizures. Right? And so if you thought that the executive branch was, in fact, not paying attention to the Bill of Rights, didn't care about the Fourth Amendment, then they should have just listened in on everyone's phone calls. They should have read everybody's emails. Why bother? As I understand it, and of course, right, there are different conflicting accounts of exactly what happened. The NSA looked at the phone numbers, right? They didn't look at the actual calls. They just looked at the phone numbers. They looked at the headers of emails. They didn't look at the content of the emails. For Americans, for people outside the country, they listened in and looked at everything they could. That is consistent with our Constitution's Fourth Amendment as interpreted by the Supreme Court. We may not like it. We may all, as citizens, want to have much broader privacy rights, right, against electronic surveillance, and we should have Congress pass such a law. This is not, Bruce will say, Congress doesn't do it, Congress is outrageous, they're so weak. But when this came up after the Supreme Court's decision in Katz and the rise of electronic surveillance, Congress passed a law in 1968, the Crime Control Act, which did set up a system to regulate electronic surveillance and in some respects broaden privacy, I think, beyond what the courts required. And so in this case, I think the executive branch tried to exercise surveillance powers as broadly as it could, but consistent with the Fourth Amendment as it had been interpreted by our Supreme Court. And if we want to have broader view of rights, the Institute for Justice, right, is a well-known libertarian organization. And so if you want to have a broader scope of individual rights, I think that's the job of Congress. Congress can pass laws and require those privacy rights to be broader in this Internet age than they have been in the past.
Michael Hayden said right after 9/11 he was summoned and told, any powers you want, you tell us, we'll give them to you. And I have reason to know that the NSA's resources went like from 80 to 80% focused on surveillance for terrorism purposes, not crime purposes like the Omnibus Crime Control Act. How many lawyers you think were assigned the task of determining whether or not the Fourth Amendment was complied with? Now, when the President's own Privacy and Civil Liberties Board finally got around to looking at the program the President entrusted to him and after been held secret for so long, you know what they said? Not only is it not authorized by statute, it doesn't work and it's unconstitutional. Now the cases are in the courts. We've had one district court say that it's unconstitutional, another one went the other way. The case is on appeal in the U.S. Court of Appeals. But we shouldn't always rely upon the courts to say whatever the last word was, and this was in 1979. The President himself, as well as Congress, should be alert to their obligation to understand liberty is the center of our constitutional universe, not empire. And when there's ambiguity, we choose liberty, not empire.
As you know, the technology issue is a hot issue, but and how we understand the Constitution. Just to the order, so we'll all know, we're going to go to this gentleman, we're going to go to the gentleman in the glasses, we're going to go to the gentleman over here, we're going to go to the gentleman over there. So everyone knows, and then the gentleman there. That will be the order, so, and then we'll end up with George. Okay, sir?
My name is Thomas Drake. I'm a pre-Snowden NSA whistleblower, and I was indicted by the Obama administration for espionage. My question is this for both of you. Is there anywhere in Article 2 of the Constitution, anywhere, that you can cite that trumps national security?
Anywhere where Article 2 is more important than national security? I apologize. I don't quite understand the question. Article 2 describes executive power. I think, unlike John, I don't believe that the use of the word executive power means the president can go to war. After all, if Article 2 goes down so far as to enumerate and express power being the right to recognize ambassadors, which is rather a formalistic right, why would it omit something as important to say the president can go to war unilaterally? I mean, that's really hiding an elephant in a mouse hole, you know? So when John's talking about what kind of language you would expect to be in there, but I don't that's all my responses. I'm not sure that I understand national security in Article 2 question.
Well, John, you've done a great deal on Article 2. What is your sense of this notion of national security in Article 2?
Yeah, I don't want to misunderstand your question, but I think what you're asking more is where does it say in the Constitution that national security trumps Article 2 or trumps the Constitution? But I mean, that's how I'll take the question, because I think that is an important and valuable question. I don't think that just a claim of national security needs itself trumps the Constitution or Article 2. However, I also don't think our framers create a Constitution that would be defective, that could not handle the challenges and threats placed on our government today by threat of terrorism or by war. Now, I don't know the particulars of your case. I'm sorry that the Obama administration prosecuted you if it was unjust. I just don't know. But I don't think that the Constitution our framers would have written a Constitution that would so paralyze our government that it could not protect the national security. The more important question is how do the President and the Congress supposed to interact properly so that we maintain this balance between national security and liberty. I don't want to be seen as arguing that liberty gets 0 and national security gets 100. The framers were practical men, and there was supposed to be a balance between the two. Sometimes our institutions might not work out the way the framers thought, and how you strike the balance properly. But I don't know the facts of your case. I can comment.
Usually used comparatively is the French Constitution has a phrase called raison d'etat, for reason of state, which then allows the state to act and wash over any civil liberties. The British have something called peace, order, and good government. We know it as POGG, which also gives the Crown extraordinary power. But as you pointed out, there's no raison d'etat clause. There's no POGG clause. I think that's what you're inquiring, and it is an omission in our Constitution, I think, is what the point you're making.
I don't mean to be associated with anyone who quotes French in public debate.
You know, for someone from Harvard, I expected a little bit more. Okay. We have the gentleman here.
Your concern is that war is breeding something like the fall and collapse of the Roman Republic into the empire. Unlike French, I like to associate with people who can quote Latin. I think that's a very valuable skill. I was going to say always wear underwear, which rhymes in Latin, but I won't. So my two responses, I just want to make sure I understand the question. So the first response is, I don't think we are an empire. If we are an empire, it's a funny empire because we don't have territory abroad. We don't run regimes. We can barely get a coalition of people to help us bomb a terrorist group in the Middle East. If we're running an empire, it's a pretty sorry empire. And in fact, the historians, the diplomatic historians who study the Cold War, it's I think the classic book is called Invitation to Empire. That the United States' expansion of its military and its stationing troops abroad was at the crying demand of the countries abroad. That it was just as much a pull as it was a push. And it's not. Right? We may have troops in Germany, troops in Japan, troops in South Korea. I don't think that those are imperial provinces of the United States. I also don't think that we are like the Republic in that we don't have a functioning legislature and that all power has concentrated in the executive. I have to say I really disagree with Bruce's implication that our government officials are engaged in fear-mongering and trying to provoke war in order to make themselves personally wealthy. For the people I worked with in the government, and of course I know only the people I worked with in government, whether I agree with them under the Obama administration or I agree with them under the Bush administration, I think that for the most part they are good-hearted public citizens, and they are trying to protect the nation's security. They're not looking to say, I'm going to go work for Lockheed now after I'm going to get a war going, and then I'm going to go build F-35s at Lockheed and get rich. I actually think that's a terrible insult to the men and women in the armed forces and our government who are out there protecting the nation's security with what I think are unfortunately rapidly dwindling resources, which are hurting that's what's hurting our security, is the cuts in the defense budget, not corruption by people in the military stoking war so they can make a personal fortune.
One of the interesting historical facts is that when...
Can I say this is just like the Marxist critique of the Vietnam War, and I'm very surprised to hear Bruce and people in this room adopting this shallow critique of the United States that was adopted by Marxists in the 1960s.
And Michael Hayden is at Booz Allen. He left the government, and Mike McConnell the same way. If you don't understand the revolving door of the intelligence community and the government, then you don't know what is going on.
Wait, so I just want to be clear about this. So you are saying that people in our government, the highest leaders, are deliberately fear-mongering and provoking war so that they can become wealthy after they leave government?
Not directly that way, but I do say that they...
that way?
No, but listen, it's not necessarily a direct quid pro quo. It's like Mr. McConnell in Virginia. But there are subtle signals, and they know what's going to happen afterwards. They don't have to bargain. They understand that with the war power on, they'll go back and have these contracts. That's what they do.
So you think that these leaders you've just mentioned and our highest government leaders are just as guilty as Governor McDonnell in Virginia, who was just convicted for corruption?
No, that's not what I said. I'm saying that you can have understandings without direct quid pro quos. And if you think the people in government don't know what's available outside as private consulting or otherwise, I just think you're very naive. They know what's there.
Let's just say that since we know many of these individuals and serve with them, that rather than ad hominem attacks, in order to elevate the debate, one of the issues that when the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower said in his last speech, the speech originally drafted allegedly by Goodpaster, had the congressional military-industrial complex. And that Eisenhower, because the two people coming in to the presidency were Kennedy and Johnson, two senators, he thought it would be inappropriate for him to have the two senators castigated and struck out the congressional relationship. But that notion of an iron triangle has been deep in our understanding of American politics and policy since that period of Eisenhower.
Too readily, the idea that we need to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, and we're surrendering our liberty in exchange for at least ostensible safety. And that's simply something that Madison couldn't understand, because the whole idea of the revolution was liberty, individual liberty. And ultimately, you're right. The remedy is not going to stick a backbone into Congress, because that's not going to happen. It's up to the American people through debate, through education, through seminars, through debates like this, to say, no, we're standing up and we're going to vote people out of office. They take us to these wars too often, and that's what happened with regard to Syria. It needs to happen again.
I didn't feel like it was a question. It was like, I agree with Bruce, but here's something else Bruce should have said. Could you comment, Bruce? So no one's asking me those kinds of questions, but I don't really think there's anything to respond to.
There's a problem. We're coming close to 8:30. This gentleman's been in the queue for quite a while.
Now listen. Ultimately, in my judgment, the destiny of the nation, war or peace, rests with we the people. If we don't get it right, if the culture doesn't get it right, the government is not going to be superior. And I recall, we had a period of time where white supremacy reigned. We had Jim Crow for 100 years. That was the ruling law. It was separate but equal. Didn't make it right, even though it was the rule that was prescribed by the United States Supreme Court. And we need to take it in our hands and not just complain about Congress and the executive branch, but that's part of it. And do something about it. Vote them out. Say that this is wrong. We don't want to do it. We did it a year ago in Syria, and that has to become the norm rather than the exception. There's only so much that a constitution and a text could do. But ultimately, as Learned Hand said, if the spirit of liberty doesn't beat in our hearts and our minds every day, it'll die, and no court and no president and no Congress can save it.
Great. John, you get the last word.
So I'll just answer the questions really quick, and then summing up, I suppose. So the first question, I don't disagree, agree with you. I think we are getting the policies that we voted for as an electorate. Now, I get the sense that majority of the people in this room don't agree with those policies, but I do think we've had a democratic process. We've had multiple elections since 9/11, and our elected representatives are making these decisions. And so I do agree with this point on Bruce's part, that if we don't agree with the policies, we can change representatives. We're not an empire where there's a Roman emperor telling us what to do. We voted for President Obama. We voted for the members of Congress. on the advertisement for the database. I don't like numbers. I admit that I don't do numbers. I'm a lawyer specifically, so I wouldn't have to do numbers. But surely you know the difference between correlation and causation. And just because there are generals or admirals who have the correlation of going to work for contractors after they retire does not show causation that these guys, men and women, are making decisions deliberately while in office to provoke wars, fearmonger, in order to enhance their employment prospects, which is what I took Bruce to say. So just to sum up, I think, Bruce says, we have this constitutional system. Our job, if we agree with him, is to vote people out, even if the different branches have different policies, even if the Constitution is interpreted by the branches differently than we would like. I would say that's what happened in 2008. We elected an avowedly anti-war president who took exactly Bruce's positions on these constitutional questions. And I just say, look at the consequences. Look what's happened to our national security and our defense posture in the last 6 years. And I think those are a direct result of the kind of policies that Bruce is promoting. And I think we are much less safe now than we were 6 years ago because of it.
Well, first, a round of applause for everyone. I think I'd like to first, both the people on the panel and the people who mentioned, thank people for their public service. I mean, one may not agree with what the interpretation is, but there are many patriots, and the patriots are serving. I want to thank the Committee of the Republic for helping to sponsor this, and the Press Club. And I want to say, these are the types of events that we think we need in order to put these issues in front and have a civil debate about what the true values are and interests. And this is a model of what we thought our democracy can and should be. And I encourage you, if you're interested in more of these type of debates, we at the American Bar Association, we've written a book called Patriot Debates, in which you go through 10 or 12 of these issues, pro and con, and try to put out the issues based on light and not anger. Because I think we have to be able to debate it rationally, and that's what we should do for ourselves and be actually a model for the rest of the world. So thank you so much for being so kind, being so civil. Thank you for more or less staying very close to your timing. And I want to thank you, and let's give another round of applause for everything.